Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Mindful Living Summit. We are on day 4. I'm Hannah Carlton, Head of Design and Development for the Awake Network, and I'm delighted to be here today with Mark Coleman to talk about how our mindfulness practice can help us connect to our world and environment. Mark Coleman is an inner and outer explorer who has practiced and studied mindfulness for 3 decades and has taught mindfulness workshops and wilderness meditation retreats internationally for the past 20 years. Through his organization, Awake in the Wild, he shares his passion for integrating meditation and nature. And he's the author of 3 books, including his most recent, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You hold a connection to nature so centrally in many of your teachings on mindfulness practice. Why is it so important for us to get outside, spend time in nature, when we're considering how to bring mindfulness into our lives?
Yeah, well, great question. And of course, I love that question since so much of my work is around nature and nature meditation practice. And it really comes from my own journey. So I've been meditating for about 35 years. I grew up in England, started meditating in England, in London mostly. And then, like most people, studied with different teachers, mostly in meditation centers and retreat centers. And that was all great. And I loved that. And I learned a lot. And when I came to America and fell in love with the wilderness, I began to take my meditation practice outside, whether it was in my garden, when I was camping, backpacking, hiking. And what I quickly discovered was that when we bring that contemplative awareness outside, when we bring mindful attention outside, it's just a tremendous support for being present, for being embodied, being in our bodies, and that the sensory world of nature, sounds, smells, sights, the wind, the breeze, the whole complexity of the natural world, it becomes a very easy place to abide in the present moment. Now, as you know, for most people, meditation practice often becomes a struggle with the mind, with thoughts, with really having difficulty to sustain any ability to be present. What I find with my own practice and with my students out in nature is that because of the allure of the natural world, its beauty, its complexity, its variability, the sensory nature of that experience, it becomes very easy to develop that present moment awareness and to really kind of live and abide with that present moment attention, to become aware of our both inner experience and our outer experience. And so it just became a natural support, not just for developing mindfulness and attention, but also because we can develop a lot of insight. A lot of wisdom teachings, whether it's from the Buddhist tradition or other traditions, pointing to these perennial truths that things are impermanent, things change, that we're intimately interconnected with all of life. And these can sometimes seem somewhat abstract ideas. When we go into nature, it's very obvious everything's changing. Things are being born and dying, things are connected and interconnected. And so it also becomes a very natural place to discover these deep truths about life, which really can inform us and inform how we live. And then I could go on for a long time. Another reason why I think it's so important to go outside, I think the average American now spends 11 hours looking at a screen. And so we know there's a lot of research about the impact of that, both on our health and well-being. When we go outside, it's such a perfect antidote. As a species, we're losing sensitivity in our sight, in our color range, in our hearing range, in our smelling range. And so when we go outside, it both wakes up our sensory nature. It's a reprieve from the screen time, which for many of us is very stressful. And in particular, what I love about the nature work and practice that I do is people access a whole range of beautiful qualities: joy, love, peace, happiness, connection, awe, wonder, intimacy, presence, that just, again, have become very easily accessible. We don't have to work hard to feel joyful when we're looking at the sunrise, as I was doing my meditation this morning, or the flight of a flock of geese flying by in wintertime. So given the stress that we're living in, the anxiety and the high rates of depression and whatnot, the more we go outside, for most of us, that's going to support our well-being, our happiness, and reduce stress and anxiety levels.
Something that we're really trying to touch on here on day 4 of this summit is this idea of interconnectedness. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how being out in nature, specifically integrating our meditation practice in nature, can help us feel more connected, not only to our inner selves, but other people, the environment, nature, our world at large.
Yeah, well, it's very, very simple and very accessible. For example, just a simple act of breathing. When we're sitting outside, we inhale, we notice the temperature, we notice the fragrance of the air. I've just come back from teaching in Mexico. There's a lot of the fragrance of saltiness from the sea. And we're directly inhaling oxygen released from the very trees, grasses, plants, plankton that we're sitting around. And so it immediately puts us in touch with all photosynthesizing life. Not as a nice idea, but actually as a real experience. And as we exhale, of course, we're breathing out carbon that gets reabsorbed by that same plant, tree, grasses, etc. And so just that very simple act is like, oh, my breath is connecting me with all flora, all photosynthesizing life, and all breathing life. We're all participating in this, in a way, this sort of collective breath. Not as a nice idea, but again, as a practical, like direct experience. In the same way that we can, in our indoors, we're sort of cut off from the elements. We're cut off from seasons, changing temperatures and whatnot. And when we're outside, we become intimately aware how connected we are. As soon as the sun goes behind the clouds, as soon as the rain starts drizzling, or the bugs start thinking you a nice breakfast, or we see that we're just part of this web of life that's always influencing our body, our heart, our mind, our mood, our perception. And so or just something as simple as feeling the connection with sunlight, right? That when we feel the warmth of that on our skin, it's like, all right, I'm part of this much greater web of life than just sitting in my office or my car or my living room. And so I think so much of our stress comes from the fact that we get sort of myopic in our experience and vision. And as soon as we step outside, we see, oh, life's going on. Oh, it's springtime. Oh, the clouds are billowing and the wind is blowing. And so it just connects us into the wider rhythm of life, whether it's the time of day, whether it's the seasons, whether we see the waning moon, whether we see different birds that are migrating. And so it just takes us out of that very small, often self-centered orientation we have that doesn't actually lead to a sense of well-being, but leads to usually to more constriction and stress.
Right, and that connectedness we can feel outdoors with all of these different elements is definitely in contrast from how at least I normally think of a traditional meditation practice, where you're in a very quiet room with your eyes closed, feeling very like inner. It's so refreshing to be able to think that you can really practice anywhere in a way that does cultivate all of this connection with things outside of ourselves.
One of the things I like about that is that I find with nature practice is it's very integrated. There's something very beautiful about a meditation room or a center where you can, as you say, access quiet, stillness, concentration, and that's all beautiful. And I love that myself. And that's not usually our lives. Our lives are busy, they're complicated, they're relational, there's a lot of stimulation. And so I find that nature practice often equips people better for sitting in a train station in New York or on the subway in London or whatever it is. And because we develop a more spacious, open awareness that actually can handle a vaster range of experience. And so we learn to find the presence, awareness, stillness in the midst of that activity, in the midst of those changing circumstances.
So when we're able to start thinking of mindfulness as more than just on the cushion, as something we can take into our everyday life, outside, the train station, wherever, you talk about these 4 areas of experience to which we can apply or integrate mindfulness: body, mind, heart, and world. Could you tell us how the practice of mindfulness, specifically maybe mindfulness in nature, can impact each of these areas?
Sure. So mindfulness of body is, perhaps as I've already explained, a little obvious when we go outside. Physical, animal, sensory nature wakes up, right? We notice immediately the temperature, our skin gets more sensitive to coolness, to breeze, to sunlight. We start noticing smells that perhaps we hadn't noticed indoors. We start noticing the range and the symphony of sounds and of light and color. And so all that's happening within our physical sensory experience. And so just that simple connection with the senses kind of wakes up an awareness of our body. As we walk outside in the forest or on the beach or in the hills, right? We become more physically present to our experience, to our breath. So really what nature allows us to do is really wake up our physical sensory experience. And of course, the other dimensions that you mentioned, as we go outside, so we also become aware of how that's impacting the heart. Right? So mindfulness is a beautiful way to illuminate our inner landscape. So in my nature work, I'm orienting not just to the outer landscape, but our inner landscape, our heart, our feelings, moods, and particularly how we're touched and influenced. And going back to that theme of interconnectedness, we're always in this dance of connection with our inner and outer landscape. We're always being influenced by people, the light, the environment, the space. And so with bringing that contemplative practice outdoors, we can see how our heart is intimately shifting and changing in response to the environment. And same with the mind. One of the things that I notice that happens when we step outside is we get, over time, less self-absorbed, less worried about our to-do list and what we're doing, where we're going, and actually just being more curious about being present. It allows the thinking, chattering mind to settle and allows us to engage that mind instead of chattering, but engage it with curiosity, with what is this place I'm in? What is this light, soundscape, etc.? And so, so the practice becomes one of being aware of the totality of our experience, our body, our mind, our heart, and the environment that we're moving in, seeing that they're one seamless landscape, right? Or two landscapes that are influencing each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'd like to kind of switch gears now to another area of your teaching and then kind of bring it back together towards the end of the interview. So you've taught and written also about this inner critic. So just give us a brief description. What is the inner critic and how can it hamper our ability to live mindfully?
Well, the inner critic is a popular theme. when I teach it, and I teach at Spirit Rock, it tends to be the most popular theme of the year, sadly, because having an inner critic is not a very fun, pleasurable experience. And the reason I decided to write my second book about it, Make Peace with Your Mind, is because having worked with students now for a couple of decades, I saw that one of the main sources that people created a lot of stress and pain and suffering for themselves and for others, but particularly for themselves, is by the listening to and believing the critical mind, the judgmental mind, the self-critical mind. And so, so I think it's essential as meditators, as people, as mindfulness practitioners, that we learn to pay attention to not just our mind, but the kinds of thoughts and habits of mind that we have. And many of us have a self-critical, very harsh, judging mind that is persecutory. You could say that the critic is trying to help us, but in a misguided way. It's often the old voices from the past, old messages from the past that we're not good enough, I'm not smart enough. And so when we buy into and believe the voice of the critic as being the voice of truth, we tend to suffer because generally the critical voice is very negative, it's harsh, it's mean, has high standards, impossible to live up to. And so, this is really one of the gifts of mindfulness practice, is we can learn to bring attention, bring awareness. Oh, what is happening in my mind? What am I saying to myself? Is it true? Is it helpful? What would happen if I not buy into that story or shift my attention elsewhere? And the reason, in the subtitle of that book, is how mindfulness and compassion can free you from the critic. The reason I talk about compassion is the critic is the impact of that is incredibly painful. And so we need to also bring a kindness and the care to ourselves who are suffering as a consequence of the critic, but also a caring attention to the critic itself to find out, what is this voice? And why is it saying what it's saying? What might be the vulnerability or the pain or the fear underneath the judgments? Right? Because if we don't bring that sort of curious awareness, then we're just going to mostly keep living within that painful habit. So the beautiful thing about mindfulness practice is it gives us the tools to become aware. So when we see something as unhealthy or destructive, like the critic can be, we can find different ways to be with it. Something as simple as just naming it. Oh, judging. Oh, hello, Mr. and Mrs. Critic. You're back again. You have a thought about how I'm doing this interview, or how I'm, parenting my kids, or whatever it is. And with that awareness, hopefully over time, we have a little bit of space from the thoughts. We can have a little bit of humor with the thoughts. And we can also see what's underneath the critic, which is often, the critic's often trying to protect us from being vulnerable. And it does so by this old, crude method of being harsh and critical of ourselves. And once we see that, we realize, oh, so there's vulnerability here. How can I work with the vulnerability in a way that's more skillful than just berating myself for being vulnerable?
And I imagine that looking at these thoughts of self-judgment and like really diving into what this inner critic is doesn't just make us more aware and compassionate of ourselves, but we can also bring more compassion and interconnectedness to the people around us, to our world. How can working with these different kinds of thoughts, self-judgment, self-doubt, help us to open up to more compassion?
Yeah, well, just like when we become aware of anything in mindfulness practice, the more we become aware of ourselves, the more we see our humanity, our common humanity. We see the vulnerability of being human, that it's hard to be human and be awake and be conscious and keep our hearts open. And so once we recognize that, we all have similar minds, similar habits, similar conditioning, then we realize that we're not the only one, that we're not the only one giving ourselves a hard time. We're not the only one with the critic judging ourselves for doing everything wrong, for not being good enough, smart enough, or whatever. And so that, it's certainly been true in my experience that it's allowed me to be much more compassionate, because I, see and work with plenty of people who have a similar habit, and it does bring out more care and more compassion in myself, because I know how painful it is, right? And so so mindfulness is a beautiful building block for empathy, because once we intimately know our own experience, it allows us to put ourselves in the shoes of another person. And most likely what comes out of that when they're suffering is care and compassion.
Could you give us a practical example of how we can deal with these self-judgmental or outer judgmental thoughts when the inner critic tells them to us?
Sure. So the first step is simply just to notice. Can you see the difference between, and I make an important distinction between a negative judgmental thought that makes us feel unworthy and bad or shame, versus a thought that has some discernment. Often we need in our lives, we need to discern things, we need to evaluate, we need to assess, we need to bring that critical mind, but it's not critical in the sense of challenging and undermining our worth and value. So we want to first just be curious, is this thought actually necessary or helpful, or is this actually just making me feel bad and hopeless about myself? So we bring mindfulness, we name it, oh, judging. In my workshops, I often have people write the judgments down, which can be sometimes a either illuminating or painful process or both. And then reading them and actually when we read something, we bring a much more critical, discerning state of mind than the thoughts that are sort of hiding, churning around in our heads. And often, and then I'll ask people to inquire, like, is this true? Is it true that I'm worthless? Is it true that I'm stupid? Is it true that I'm unlovable? Is it true that I'm never going to get my life together? And what we start to see is the critic generalizes, exaggerates, and universalizes. We may make a mistake at work, and the judge says, well, you're always hopeless at work. You're always making mistakes. Like, well, I'm human. I make mistakes. Part of being human, but it's not always true. Doesn't make me a bad person. So the naming, the seeing, the recognition, the writing down, and then reflecting on, where might this judgment be coming from? Sometimes it sounds like our mother's voice, our father's voice. It sounds like the priest's voice, and so sometimes when we can track the historical root of it, it can also help us create a little space.
How does your nature work come into the work that you're doing with helping people notice their inner critic?
Well, one of the beautiful ways that the nature work supports the inner critic work is that when we go outside, as I was last week, and around, there'd just been a big storm in England, and there's a beautiful oak tree that had lost a limb, and lots of its branches were fallen to the ground, and it was a little gnarly and old and looked a little beaten up. And when we look at nature, generally, we don't bring the same critical mind as we do to ourselves. When we look in the mirror, our critic is usually very harsh, and this is not right, this should be different. We look at a tree or a rock or a mountain, and we don't go, oh, that mountain needs to tidy itself up a little bit. That tree needs to lose a little bit of its girth. No, we just think, oh, it's nature. It's beautiful as it is. It's perfectly imperfect. It's just doing its thing. And so sometimes that perspective, we can begin to include ourselves. All right, I'm also nature. We think we're separate from nature. We're in nature. We happen to be slightly weird with these long, limbs and hair on the top, and so when we see that we're just part of the natural world that's doing its own thing, it's aging and changing, and it can help bring a softening of this idea that we should somehow be perfect, we should stay the same. So it can tend to bring a quality of acceptance and a sense of welcoming, right? When we go outside, often people feel a sense that nature, trees, what rocks, what are mountains, are not judging them. They're just welcoming you into the space. And so that can rub off, so we can develop a more non-judgmental, accepting quality of attention.
So we've talked about how to look at our inner critic, how to use mindfulness to help that. We've looked at how to practice mindfulness in nature, kind of going even more broad. Applying using mindfulness in the world is a really interesting idea, and one that we're really trying to focus on this last day of the summit. Big question: how does our personal practice help us not only relate with, but engage in our world and the challenges that are happening around us?
Yeah, well, it's a really important question. And, the truth is they're not separate, right? Our practice with ourselves, we are part of the world. And even though we can feel separate, distant. And so what I'm doing here in this little microcosm of the world, and what I'm doing with you or with my neighbors or at work or wherever I am in the world, it's not different, right? The beauty of mindfulness practice and meditation in general is it's a laboratory, and we can be in a very introspective way with ourselves, with our experience, with our mind, with our habits, with our reactions, with our joys and sorrows. And so we're learning, meditation is a training. We're learning to develop beautiful qualities of presence, of awareness, of acceptance, of kindness, of non-reactivity, of inclusivity, etc. And so when we learn to cultivate those qualities here in this universe called me, then naturally they start to spill out into how I'm talking to you or my family, or how I'm interacting online or in the store. And so one immediate way we start to see that is we just start to see that the quality of attention and kindness that we're learning to cultivate in our practice is something that begins to be part of who we are, that we take wherever we are. And so that's one sort of more in a kind of microcosm way. And then, of course, as we develop awareness, we become more sensitive, we become more aware of what's happening. We actually become less self-centered, more curious of what's happening around us. And of course, we can't not look around at the world at this time and see the tremendous suffering, tremendous challenges, climate change, coronavirus, you name it, and tremendous amount of social harm and oppression and racism and poverty and inequality. And so when we bring that quality of attention and kind-heartedness to the world, of course, what one of the things that arises is a responsiveness, right? The point of our practice is not just to become great cushion sitting meditators, but actually how to learn to live these qualities of presence, kindness, wisdom in the world. And one of the things that's needed, and I think that's very much happening in what I see certainly in the mindfulness world and the Buddhist world, and where traditions were more introspective, is we're starting to see, no, we can't just run away to a cave or a mountain, that we have to be intimately engaged in the world and act in whatever way to reduce harm and suffering and poverty and oppression and the ecological crisis. And so I think it's important for all of us to be in dialogue and reflection of how is my practice manifesting and what is my role. It doesn't mean we all have to go out and become saviors. That's not the point, but to have that be part of one's practice, one's reflection as a question, like what is right relationship? What is right engagement with the climate crisis, for example? What is my role both individually and collectively? And so there's not particularly an answer or a path, but it's having an openness and an aliveness and an inquiry to have that question, how can I serve? You know, as we develop greater awareness and heartfulness, the natural expression is one to move and help not just reduce my own suffering, but really help reduce suffering in the world. And so that becomes, I think, as we mature in our practice, becomes really one of the most potent forces in our practice.
I love how you spoke of as we practice more, develop our own practice, we open to a more responsive way of engaging with the world as we notice these things around us, this suffering. Our motivation, as you said, to help alleviate that suffering grows. Often, when we're looking at these global crises, for example, climate change, I know for me, the more I hear about it, the more I notice, yes, the more motivation I have to ease the suffering, but also I feel a sense of overwhelm. There's often, it often feels like there's just too much going on for anything I do to like ever make a difference. I feel very overwhelmed, and my tendency is, when I get overwhelmed, is more to shut down. How can mindfulness help us be responsive, help ease suffering, but at the same time take care of ourselves?
Yeah, well, as I say, they're not separate, and I think as we cultivate mindfulness, we're learning to develop an attunement internally and externally. And of course, we have to be mindful of what's needed here in our own experience, and also where we can be of use and effect and impact. And you know, as you point to, that something like climate crisis is so massive in scale and easily overwhelming. We can easily feel hopeless, powerless. And so it's important that we also bring it close to home. You know, how am I living? What am I doing with my time and my money and my actions? And what am I consuming? And how am I living simply, or am I making personal choices that actually are life sustaining? You know, am I eating food that comes from a local farm rather than from some agribusiness that's destroying the soil? You know, for something as simple as that. So it's important that we keep our attention to, what's possible here locally. There's a whole lot to say about working with the climate crisis. One simple phrase that I like is action eats anxiety. So I'm actually giving a workshop later in the year on eco-anxiety, about the anxiety and fear that's arising with the climate crisis. And one of the most important things to do around that is, aside from holding that with kindness and awareness, is to engage with others, is to find ways to get involved, so that that energy of anxiety actually has a natural channel and an outlet. So you're doing something that has some meaning and some usefulness. So I think it's really important that we find, what's happening locally, who are our peers and allies, how can we engage? And it's also important to make room for the feelings. So a lot of my inspiration comes from the work of Joanna Macy, who talks about the need, the natural response of a healthy ecosystem when it's hurting is to grieve and respond. And right now, the planet as an ecosystem is hurting. And it's natural that we feel sad, grief, loss, fear, rage, because what we love, the earth, is hurting, is being damaged. And so it's important that we both take care of our feelings, listen, feel, sense, grieve, and then allow whatever impulse, intention, movement to come from that. Well, yes, there's grief, and what wants to happen here that would be that would be of some use. And that's going to be different for everybody. For some, it's, growing an organic garden. For some, it's campaigning in the, outside your congressperson's house. For some, it's forming together in a community and doing some local actions. For some, it's deep meditation. It looks different for different people.
I love this idea of leaning into the grief, the suffering, the issues, rather than trying to remove ourselves from them, which really, to me, kind of seems counterintuitive. If you're feeling anxiety about something, you're saying, lean into it, really engage in it, instead of just shutting it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's here, right? We're living with it. And if we don't deal with it, if we don't feel it, usually what happens is numbness. And numbness is one of the greatest threats to where we are, because out of numbness arises inaction. And what we most need right now is engaged citizens to act, as well as engaged institutions to act. Or the citizens need to engage our institutions to take much more, rapid and significant actions to shift us away from where we're heading climactically.
Do you have any advice on how we can lean into these uncomfortable feelings? Do you have any simple practices, advice, tips?
Yeah. So, there's probably not a day goes by that I don't feel a wave of sadness or loss or grief. I was just in England, where I'm from, and in England, as beautiful and as pastoral it is, I was just visiting my parents, and beautiful morning bird song. And I'm also aware that Britain, in the last, I believe it's 40, 50 years, has lost, I think, 70% of its songbirds. There's a tremendous amount of birds. And so, so as I'm walking outside in the morning with my cup of tea and I'm listening to the birds, I'm also feeling how sad that bird song is very different than when I grew up. And so it's just letting it's like letting the waves wash through us or over us. And whenever we love something, then of course the natural response when it's hurting is to feel sad or grief. And so also acknowledging that when we feel that tenderness or sadness or grief or loss, know that it's coming, the deeper layer of that is coming from love. If we didn't love, if we didn't care, we wouldn't feel. We just get on with our day. But because we do care and we do love, it's just a natural part of that process. And so I think one of the important things to remember is that all emotion, like grief and sadness, they're waves. And so it's important that we just let the waves wash over us, knowing that once that wave, like it did for me when I was in the garden listening to the birdsong, it's a wave of sadness arises. I feel a little tender and it passes. And I'm back to appreciating the preciousness of the birdsong because, oh, and there's still birds here, right? Not all birds have gone. And so allow me to feel love, feel connected, feel appreciation, and also reflecting on, oh, what can I do? Is there a way that I could engage somehow in England, even though I don't live there anymore? Like, what would be a way to support an organization, people that I care about doing good work there, like whether it's Extinction Rebellion or other movements. So it allows greater capacity. If we shut down the feeling, then we just go numb, and we don't feel and then don't act.
Mark, thank you so much for all of this information that you have given us, for your wisdom and your knowledge. As we're coming close to the end of our session, I'm going to ask you to lead a guided meditation here in a minute. Is there anything else that you would like to add, whether it's about your own work or anything else we've talked about today?
I think as an advocate of nature meditation practice that I am, if people have been interested in that, the most obvious thing to do is to go outside, right? You can look out your window and you can think about nature and you can watch great nature programs on Discovery, but really the practice is stepping outside with a contemplative practice. And my work is, and the book is called Awake in the Wild, but you don't really have to go into the wilderness. The wildness of nature is everywhere, including in cities, with the skies and the cycles of the stars and the moon, the wind and the rain, and the parks and plant life. And so I just invite everybody, if there's an interest, to explore what it's like to take your practice outside. It might be sitting in your garden or on your deck, or doing some mindful walking in a park, or if you have longer time, going out into the woods or the beach or the hills for half a day, and turning your phone off and spending an hour or two in silence and just taking in your senses, allowing the senses to open up, using the support of the breath and the body as a ground, but really letting the attentiveness to the natural world really be your kind of broader scope for meditation, and seeing how nourishing and natural and accessible presence and awareness is in that experience.
I'm wondering if you could lead a practice that someone could take out into nature today.
Sure. Yeah. So, okay. So let's just do a little practice together. So this is going to be, since you're all on the screen, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. And just becoming aware of your body sitting, or aware of whatever posture your body is in. And becoming aware of your breathing. Breathing in air, in oxygen that's been released from trees and plants and grasses, plankton. Breathing out carbon reabsorbed by the same plant life. And just noticing how breathing connects us with a much broader web of life. Be aware of your body, sitting, whatever you're sitting on the earth. Know that you're part of the earth's moving surface, aware of itself, aware of the environment. And opening up to the experience of sounds, of hearing. Nature sounds, human sounds, mechanical sounds. And again, noticing how sounds, how hearing connects the outer and the inner landscape. Experiencing sound as vibration and noticing what the sounds evoke in your body and heart and mind. And be aware, no matter where you're doing this meditation, whether at home, in an office, some building somewhere, always part of a larger ecosystem. So becoming aware of the ecosystem in which you're sitting or living, aware of life happening outside, outdoors, the season, the weather patterns, time of day, the cycle of the sun and moon. To remember that we're always sitting in much vaster systems, nature, weather, seasons. And then taking a moment to reflect on a time, ideally recently, that you were touched by the natural world. The song of a bird, particular tree, in winter or in spring blossoming, or a particular park or woodland that you enjoy, a lake, the sea. And notice what happens when you bring to mind natural landscape that has touched you, has moved you in some way. For me, it's living near the towering redwood trees, thousands of year-old trees, a beautiful presence. And notice if even the simple reflection about these places in nature touch you in some way, evoke a quality, feeling, a memory, mood. And also reflecting on the fragility of life, the impermanence of things. Nature is a beautiful teacher of impermanence, interconnectedness. And right now we can also be aware of the vulnerability of the natural world, of the untold amount of endangered species, endangered habitats, reefs, oceans, streams, wetlands. And noticing what happens when we attend to the parts of nature that are vulnerable, that are under a threat. Holding any feeling that arises in response to that, maybe tenderness, sadness, love, care. And to reflect on this phrase, we protect what we love. We protect what we love as human beings. That which we care and love for, we're more likely to steward and protect. And so notice as you reflect on the wider cycles of life, the natural world that touches you. Is there any impulse or movement in the heart and the mind in which to care or express that care? Any way that you may choose to act or live with less harming, with more stewardship of this beautiful home we call Earth. And in your own time, in this meditation, if you happen to be near a window or sitting outside or on a porch or something, you can look around and take in the natural world, the sky, the trees, wherever you are. As I'm doing right now, looking at the sky and the water. And just noticing how when you cultivate some contemplative presence and you bring that attentiveness to nature, it can be very profound. So thank you for meditating with me.
Thank you, Mark, for that beautiful practice and your time with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.